In this class, we are going to learn sourdough baking from rye. I really believe that it's the easiest flour to work with from the very beginning. It's really the first bread that I would recommend any beginner to start with. Rye has very little gluten, so you actually can't shape it like you shape the wheat bread or a spelt bread, for example. You can't make it a very nice round loaf. Well, you can, but it won't be as fluffy, and it really requires a lot of skill, and it's very difficult to create those gorgeous, round, huge sourdough breads with rye without adding any additional flour to it. So the way out here is very easy. Traditionally, rye bread is also often baked in bread forms, and this is exactly what we are going to do. The fact that you can use a simple bread form instead of shaping and scoring the bread means that you don't need to knead and you don't need to shape. So it's really much easier, and it does require much less active time. I'm Anastasia Sharova, and I will be your instructor in this course. There is a second instructor in this course whose face you won't see as much as mine, but please, I want you to know that she is the person who is actually behind the scenes. She is the one who is baking in the course. She's also the one who spent years of learning healthy sourdough baking from top experts in Russia, and this is my mother. During this course, I will be her voice. It also so happened that she was the person to actually teach me to do sourdough, and she is my sourdough baking guru. Rye has a very strong nutty flavor. It's a little bit dark in color. It's also a more dense bread. Rye is considered to be one of the healthiest flours, the one that still contains gluten. So yes, if you're gluten sensitive, you might not be able to eat rye, then you need to explore gluten-free sourdough breads, which is also possible. But it has significantly less gluten than wheat, and it has a really rich nutrient profile. There is also a lot of research available supporting rye bread aiding weight loss and helping maintaining healthy blood sugar levels. One more huge advantage of rye versus wheat breads is that it stays fresh for a very long time. So if you buy really soft, nice white breads, then in 1 or 2 days they will probably not taste as good as they did at the beginning. And this is absolutely not the case with rye bread. It can stay fresh for as long as 2 weeks, and you can keep eating it. It will be still soft. You can make a toast out of it, of course, if you want as well. But this is amazing because you can really bake a little bit in advance and not be afraid that your bread will go stale very fast. I bake every 4 or every 7 days, and the bread baking now is a huge part of my routine, of my weekly routine, and I will share with you in the course later of what kind of schemes you can use so that you adjust it to your timetable and your lifestyle. The base ingredients that you will need for your sourdough is flour, water and salt. The main flour is rye, and we will use 2 types mostly. One is whole grain, and it's really rough, you can see it. This is what we will be using for the starter, to grow the starter and to feed the starter later. And then the second one is also whole grain, but it's much finer. It's milled much finer. It still has a lot of protein inside, and it has a lot of nutrition inside, but it will give a lighter texture to the bread. And when it comes to water, there are really not that many rules. In most countries we can use normal tap water, but it should be chlorinated. So it's recommended that you just put the water in the normal pot and you keep it in the open for some time, for a couple of hours, so that the chlorine can evaporate. It's not recommended to boil the water because there are a lot of live organisms that will be killed immediately by the hot temperatures. You can also use normal spring water, but it's not necessary. As for salt, please make sure that you don't use normal table salt, and definitely not iodized salt or no salt with any type of additions. Best is find really good artisan salt. We usually use Himalayan pink salt, but it can also be your local salt, and it needs to be raw and very high quality. Of course, salts like pink Himalayan salts or high quality sea salt or Celtic salts, they seem to be very expensive, but it's really worth it, and we will need just a very tiny bit to make sure that the fermentation process is going correctly and that also our breads have really nice flavor. As an optional part that you might want to eat in the bread, and I will give you some recipe suggestions, is malt. And there are 2 types of malt. It can be active, in that way it contributes to the fermentation process, but it doesn't necessarily have any flavor characteristics, and there are also inactive malts which just add flavor to your bread. In Russian baking traditions and in German one, malt is used a lot, but I understand that sometimes it's really hard to find. So it's not necessary, but if you can lay your hands on it, then get it, and it can really improve your flavor of your breads significantly. There are also a lot of additions for flavors that you can add to the bread. One of them is seeds. The most common seeds to use are sesame seeds, sunflower seeds, and pumpkin seeds. You can also be wild with imagination and add nuts and things like that, but I should tell you one secret about seeds. Besides adding extra flavor and nutrition in texture, it also can create a wonderful crust. So we will show you a technique when you add a lot of seeds on top of your bread, or you can even cover your bread loaf completely in the seeds, and then they roast very nicely in the oven, and they're so delicious and crunchy on the top of your crust. These are actually my favorite types of breads. Or you can also add it to the dough just before the final proofing stage, and you will taste your seeds here and there inside the dough, but they will not be crunchy, they will be soft. And another common addition is, of course, spices. In this course, we are focusing on rye. So there are 4 classic spices that are added to the rye loaves. It's fennel seeds, dill seeds, or dill greens, actually the one that you see here in the video. It's not the seeds, but it's a dry herb dill. And I love it the most. Actually, it's my favorite type of a spice, but it's a very Russian flavor. People make fun that, you know, Russians always put dill everywhere. It's pretty much true. We love this spice, this herb. Another spice is whole coriander seeds and also cumin. Now, coriander seeds and cumin, you should be very careful with them because they have really, really strong flavors. So don't put too much, of course, unless you really love them, but they can also add a bit of bitterness to your loaves. And probably you'll notice that in bread baking we use seeds. Yeah, we don't use ground spices because we actually don't want them to get lost. Not just because of the visual aspect, but also for the texture and the type of the flavor that they add. More gentle flavors like paprika or basil or oregano can also be added to breads, but they do get a little bit lost with rye. So these are better additions when you bake with wheat or spelt or that types of flours. One more spice that I can recommend for the mixed bread is fenugreek seed. I love the taste, but again, frankly speaking, there are no hard rules. You just need to see what works for your taste buds, but just try to bake without any spices first, without any flavor additions, because you should understand the flavor of your personal rye bread. As for the equipment, you really don't need too much to start with. Yes, you need bread baking forms. You'll also need some mixing bowls. It's great if you have a KitchenAid or some kind of a mixer that can mix your dough, but if you don't, it's okay. Just have a large wooden spoon, huge pot to mix it. You will also need glass jars to make the starter. So we will use a glass jar to grow the starter, then the glass jar to keep the starter, a very small one, and another third glass jar to actually make the levain. But these are technical details, we'll get into it later and you will understand. But yes, as I said, keep 3 glass jars. Then one more really crucial thing though that you will need is a kitchen scale. You will see that all the measurements are given in grams, and it's really important to follow them at the beginning. Later, when you develop the baking instinct, you can just use glasses and proportions, and this is what I do now quite often. I know approximately how the dough should look like, and I have the feeling of how much flour and what I should add, so I don't use a kitchen scale, but at the beginning it's crucial. If you want a successful bread loaf without any complications, use the kitchen scale. For the breads that we are going to bake in this course, you will need bread baking forms. A really good material is ceramics. It gives amazing crust. Sometimes you can have a little difficulty with taking it out, but it's rare. So I can also definitely recommend ceramics, and it's also the most eco-friendly material if it's something of your concern. We are ready to start baking the bread itself. There are 4 stages of making a sourdough rye. First of all, you have to refresh your starter. Second, you need to make a levain. The third stage is actually mixing the bread, mixing all the ingredients, putting it into the bread forms and leaving it to rise. And the fourth stage is baking the bread. There is also one more stage that I could put as a fifth. I'll mention it here, but It doesn't need any active participation. So the fifth stage is actually letting the bread to cool down. It's best to eat your rye sourdough after 24 hours. Yes, it has to cool down and set, and it tastes the best, and it's also the easiest to digest. Some people say it's even 48 hours for the best effect, but usually 24 hours are enough. To be honest, sometimes it's really difficult not to cut and eat your hot bread loaf right away, because it smells so amazing, you'll feel how crunchy the crust is, but please wait, at least one night, at least 12 hours, wait for it. Because you might feel that it's a little wet when you cut it, and it's actually not very healthy to eat the bread that is not properly baked. One of the very important things to understand when you do the sourdough baking is a schedule. So we give you a schedule as a reference, how it works in the certain temperatures. I'll give you two schedules. One is for the cooler ended temperature, and the second one is for the much warmer one. Because depending on the temperature in your house, there will be a certain speed of fermentation of your sourdough. I want to say a very important note generally on the temperatures. I read once in a book of Jeffrey Hammelman, and I'll leave the link to this book because I think it's really, if you want to go very deep into the bread baking, it's one of the best sources where you can find the scientific and deep information if you love to read books and go really, really deep into the subjects. And he put it wonderfully. He said it about the starter initially, that, nowadays when you read many books and listen to many bread bakers and feel that to create your own sourdough, especially starter, you need to be no less an alchemist. There should be some magic, and there needs also to be like a perfect environment for everything. Well, truth to be told, the completely 100% controlled environment is only possible in a professional setting. They have the equipment, they have the boxes that maintain a certain temperature and humidity, and then they have 100% the same result every time that they make a bread loaf. At home, it's actually not necessary. It's even exciting sometimes to have a bit of a different result. And also, as you bake more often, you really understand how your environment affects your bread, and you understand what kind of flavors you can achieve with your own ingredients in your own house. So don't stress too much if the temperature in your house is plus or minus 3 or 4 degrees, and if some things take longer or less than it's prescribed. As I said, our schedule is just a reference. Now let's get to our stages of fermentation and bread baking. The first thing that you need to do when you plan to make your sourdough loaf is to refresh the starter. The starter spent a few days in the fridge and it kind of fell asleep and lost a bit of its strength, and you want to give it more life and to give it more strength again. For this, you feed the starter. So you just take out of the fridge those 30 grams of the strong starter, which is slightly asleep, and you add 30 grams of water and you add 30 grams of flour. After you mixed the starter, after you fed the starter, again you keep it with the lid, you mark with a marker or with a rubber band, and you keep it to ferment. In my rather cold house, I'm doing it overnight. For me, it takes about 10 hours to reach the desired size. I will also keep the second schedule for warmer climates, and then you have to start in the morning. Don't start in the evening, because the whole process will be significantly faster. The next morning you wake up, you'll see that your renewed starter is bubbly and strong, and you're just going to take 30 grams from this refresh starter and keep again in the fridge. You see, it's a cycle. You always keep 30 grams in the fridge. You keep the cycle. This is your living organism. He lives there, the 30 grams. And then you take 60 grams and go to the next stage. Creating the levain or the pre-ferment is the same process as refreshing or making a starter. You take starter, you take water, and you take flour. You mix it all together in much larger quantity, so you'll need a bigger glass jar than just for a starter, and you keep it aside. For me, I do it in the morning, so if I left my starter, I refreshed the starter yesterday at 10 p.m, so probably today at around 8 a.m. I can already put my levain, and for me it takes about 6 hours for levain to double. Again, for you, the indication is absolutely the same, and this is the easiest indication ever. Some bakers recommend that you have to Try your starters and smell them and your levains, and then you will understand if it's ready or not. It's good indication. Yes, it has to smell in a particular way, taste in a particular way. So these are all valid methods, but the easiest one is just to see that it's simply double in size. Again, this is why we recommend to use the glass jars, and that's what we use instead of the bowls, because in theory you could use a clay bowl, but you can't really see the process. Here, look in this video, you see, I can see all the bubbles, I can see how strong it is, and now it's ready to use. We can mix the bread, and to mix the bread we just want to mix all the ingredients. So the best way is that when you take the levain and you mix it with water, because you want it to dissolve really nicely, and this is also the time when you add salt. Or you can even mix the salt with the water and then mix it with the levain, and you don't want to have any big chunks of levain left because it's still very thick. Yeah, we are giving you really thick formulas. And then is the time to add your flour. You just add it very slowly because you have to mix it. The way you mix your dough will depend on the type of flour that you use. If you use 100% rye, you actually don't need to knead it at all. You don't need to knead it, you don't need to shape it. You just take a large spoon, better if it's a wooden spoon, it can even be a spatula, and you keep mixing it. It's great if you have a KitchenAid or some other machine that can help you do it, but if not, it's absolutely doable with your hands. It's important that you mix it really thoroughly, that everything incorporates nicely, so it will take some time, at least 5 minutes of mixing we recommend. There should be no dry flour left, and everything should be mixed in very nicely inside. If there is wheat or spelt or any other flour with a big content of gluten, you have to knead. You have to make your hands dirty, so to speak. Just make sure there is no nail polish, otherwise it will end up in the bread itself. You can knead in the bowl, you can knead on the table. In this course we are not focusing on kneading techniques because we are focusing on the rye bread itself, but just remember, if you use the formula with the addition of wheat, of spelt, or barley, or einkorn, or one of the other gluten flours, you have to knead it. Because gluten has to develop, and it's a bit of a different chemistry that's happening inside your dough. This is also the time when you can add some spices, or you can add some seeds that you would love. Throw inside as much as you want, but be careful, don't become too generous with adding it, because if you add too much, it will also interfere in the fermentation process. Again, in the formulas and the recipes, we will give some suggestions of how much and what you can add. Now that you mixed your bread, you can either right away put it into the bread forms, or you can cover it in the seeds and then put it in the bread forms. I really love to cover my bread in the seeds. Why? Because it gives an amazing and a very special crust, especially the sunflower seeds. Trust me, you've never tried something like this before. And be very generous. It can be covered in the seeds completely. Keep in mind that they will be roasted, so it will be very easy to chew them, they will be very crunchy, and the seeds are extremely nutritious, by the way. It's something that you really want to have in your diet on a regular basis. Before you put the dough into the form, make sure to smear it with a little bit of oil. It can be ghee, or it can be olive oil, or whatever oil that you use in your house. Just make sure it's a healthy one. Check out our healthy cooking bootcamp if you want to go deep into the healthy cooking oils, because it's also like a huge topic in itself. So smear the sides of your form with the oil. Once you put the bread in the forms, now it's time for the final proofing. Your bread has to rise. When you put it inside, make sure that you only fill up half of the form, no more. It can be a little less, but no more. Because before we put it into the oven, we want it to double in size again. We are trying to not use the plastic as much as possible, but here in this course, kind of the classic procedure was followed. So you see us using the transparent plastic film to cover on top. For the beginners, it's really recommended to use it to cover your dough so that you can see how much it raised without bothering it, without opening it. Because if you open it, the temperature of the dough will change. It will interfere in the fermentation process. With time, you can just use kitchen towel, because you will know already how many hours exactly it will take for your bread to double in the form. But at the beginning, it's recommended to cover with something where you can observe what's happening. Here, the proofing stage will really differ depending on both the strength of your levain, your starter, and also your ambient temperatures. For me, in the colder climate, it takes about 4 hours, which is really, really long, but sometimes 2 hours are really enough for your bread to double in size. Make sure that you don't kind of bother your loaf too much in the form, because if you shake it, it will really affect, how much up it went. Just leave it there and let it do its magic. Your bread double in size. Look how big and bubbly it is. It's ready to go inside into the oven. But before you put it into the oven, make sure that the oven is really, really hot. It's super important. So how much you can heat it will depend on your oven, but usually it can go to as high as 240, 250 degrees, sometimes even higher. If it goes higher, it's great. Just heat it as much as possible. I have a thermometer which showed me actually how long it takes for me to heat the oven. It takes my oven 45 minutes to heat to 250 plus degrees, so it's not a 10-minute job. That's why I recommend that, at the beginning, estimate that it might take about 4 hours for your bread to rise, for example, so you can start heating the oven already in advance, that your bread doesn't become too sour, that it doesn't overproof. And when the oven is very, very hot, you open it and put your bread forms inside, your delicious, almost ready bread inside. And you follow a very, very simple formula. You bake the bread at the maximum temperature for just 15 minutes. Already after 15 minutes, you will see that there is a crust coming up, that is already golden, and you will feel the smell of the bread. At that point, you want to reduce the temperature to 200 and bake for another 40 minutes. I'm saying a lot of things. I'm saying, as you see in every single stage, that everything will also depend on your personal conditions, on your personal ingredients, on your personal oven. While this is the recommendation that we give, yours might need some adjustment. And actually, after the first loaf, you will already understand it. So when you make your first loaf, please write us in the comments how it worked out. For example, it will really depend on the size of your loaf, on the type of your form sometimes, how long you have to bake it. But this kind of general formula usually works for everyone or for most of people. Sometimes you need to bake a little more or a little less at the highest temperature, but these are all minor things that you can adjust in time to create the best loaf you can. And here you go, your healthiest, the most delicious sourdough bread is ready. See how it looks fresh out of the oven. So what you want to do now when it's ready is just take it out of the form. Don't keep it inside because it will become wet because of the condensation. You want to take it out, and if you made it properly, if you use a good form, then it will not be a problem. So when you take your loaf out of the form when it's ready, you want to cool it down on the grill. It's best if you don't put it just on the plate or on a wooden board. We have a grill, but you can also use some tricks like putting wooden sticks like chopsticks or putting wooden spatulas. So the main idea is that there is a bit of space between the bottom flat surface and your bread loaf. There should be air in between, It shouldn't become wet and hot under your loaf. Then you can cover it with a kitchen towel and keep, as I said, best for 24 hours, but at least overnight before you cut it and enjoy your very first sourdough bread piece with any favorite topping on top. But to be honest, it's going to be so tasty that you're not gonna mix it with anything. You're gonna love it just as it is. Thank you so much for joining our course, to coming to the end, and hopefully to actually doing all the steps and baking your first and your 10th and your 100th sourdough loaf. I want to encourage you to be brave and experiment with your sourdough. I feel that it's so amazing that this tradition of traditional bread baking is coming back to our homes, to our busy homes, and that we can carry on, develop it, and maybe make into a new norm to bake your own bread at home. Please, when you make your loaves, share with us how it looked, how it worked. Tell us if you have any challenges. Share the pictures of your bread loaves. If you have some suggestions or ideas, let us know. So thank you again from me and from my mom, from both of us, for taking your time to start learning to do your sourdough bread at home.